In this video, we will be removing an original clutch and flywheel and then installing an ACT performance clutch and flywheel. While this video provides a general visual overview of the most common installation steps, it is in no way intended to replace a factory service manual which contains detailed procedures and specifications. We start by disconnecting the ground cable from the negative side of the battery and moving the cable away from the terminal to assure it will not make accidental contact. To remove the intercooler, remove all the fastening hardware and disconnect all the hoses. Unbolt and remove the bracket located on the right side of the intercooler, and then lift the intercooler up and out of the engine compartment. Remove the transmission ground strap located on the firewall and remove the ground strap located on top of the starter. Unbolt the slave cylinder and move it out of the way. Do not disconnect the hydraulic line. Unbolt and remove the upper engine mount. Disconnect the electrical connectors located on top of the transmission. Remove the two bell housing bolts near the turbo which are accessible from the top of the engine. Unbolt and remove the heat shield located over the turbo. Unbolt the downpipe from the turbo and remove the heat shield bracket assembly. Raise the crimp sections of the axle nut using a punch or something similar. With someone in the vehicle pressing on the brake pedal, loosen the axle nuts. Lift the vehicle and remove the tire and wheel assemblies. Remove the axle nuts and discard them. It is not recommended that they be reused. Drain the transmission oil. Unbolt and disconnect the front arm ball joints from the housings. Using a crowbar, remove the front axle shafts from the transmission and hub assemblies. Disconnect the oxygen sensor electrical connector on the side of the transmission and disengage it from the crossmember. Unbolt the exhaust hanger bracket in the center. Unbolt the heat shield below the turbo and the front exhaust hanger bracket from the transmission. Disconnect the rubber hangers from the rear of the exhaust and remove the entire exhaust system from the vehicle. Unbolt and remove the center heat shield. Before removing the driveshaft, make alignment marks on the flange yoke and rear differential. Then unbolt the rear hardware followed by the bolts near the center bearing and remove the driveshaft. Looking around both sides of the transmission, disconnect all remaining electrical connectors. Unbolt and remove the transmission stay, then unbolt and remove the gear shift rod. Place the transmission jack under the transmission. Remove the crossmember bolts from the vehicle's body and lower the transmission a few inches. Remove the lower bell housing bolts and nuts and then unbolt the starter, setting it aside and out of the way. We didn't like the way the transmission sat on our transmission jack, so we removed the entire crossmember assembly and then repositioned the transmission jack so that the transmission weight would be better distributed when it is separated from the engine. Separate the transmission from the engine and then lower and remove it from under the vehicle. With the transmission out of the vehicle, we removed the clutch release fork and release bearing, then cleaned off all the dirt and grease from the input shaft, guide tube, and pivot ball. Using the packet of purple Ceram lube supplied with the new ACT clutch kit, lightly coat the input shaft splines, guide tube, pivot ball, and the surface of the clutch release fork that will make contact with the release bearing. Install the new release fork and release bearing and check to make sure it operates freely with no binding. Anytime a clutch is replaced, due to known wear, it is recommended the clutch release fork be replaced with a new one. Unbolt and remove the old pressure plate and disc. Unbolt and remove the old flywheel. Install the ACT flywheel using new factory flywheel attachment bolts. Tighten all the bolts gradually at first until snug and then torque the bolts to 55 foot-pounds in a crisscross pattern. Before setting the disc in place, make sure to clean the flywheel and pressure plate friction surfaces with some sort of non-petroleum based cleaner. Install the ACT disc, making sure the transmission side marking is facing away from the engine. Use the supplied alignment tool to hold it in place. Install the ACT pressure plate using the new 8mm bolts included in the kit. Gradually tighten all the bolts while making sure the disc is centered, and once all the bolts are snug, torque the bolts to 26 foot-pounds in a crisscross pattern. After the proper torque has been applied to the bolts, remove the alignment tool. Lift the transmission back into place. Install the starter and lower bell housing bolts and nuts. Tighten the bolts and nuts to 37 foot-pounds. Because we removed the entire crossmember assembly, we again repositioned the transmission jack and reinstalled the crossmember to the transmission. Lift the transmission high enough to reattach the crossmember to the vehicle's body and torque the 2 front bolts to 103 foot-pounds and the 4 rear bolts to 52 foot-pounds. Reinstall the gear shift rod and torque the hardware to 9 foot-pounds. Reinstall the transmission stay and torque the hardware to 13 foot-pounds. Reinstall the driveshaft, making sure that the marks made before removal are all lined up. Torque the rear bolts to 23 foot-pounds and then the bolts at the center bearing to 38 foot-pounds. Reinstall the center heat shield. Reinstall the exhaust, making sure to install and tighten all the bolts back into the heat shield below the turbo and the front exhaust bracket. Align the center exhaust bracket and reinstall and tighten the bolt. Route and reconnect all the electrical connectors. Reinstall the axle shafts into the transmission and hub assemblies and then reinstall the front arm ball joints into the housings. Torque the housing bolts to 37 foot-pounds. Install new axle nuts, and with someone in the vehicle pressing on the brake pedal, torque the axle nuts to 162 foot-pounds. After tightening the axle nut, lock it securely using a punch or something similar. Reinstall the tire and wheel assemblies and torque the lug nuts to 75 foot-pounds. Reinstall the 2 bell housing bolts near the turbo that are accessible from the top of the engine, and then reinstall the downpipe bolts and heat shield bracket assembly. Reinstall the ground strap located above the starter. Reinstall the ground strap located on the firewall and reconnect the electrical connectors located on top of the transmission. Reinstall the heat shield over the turbo. Clean the pivot of the slave cylinder and lightly coat the contact area with purple Ceram lube. Reinstall the slave cylinder and tighten the bolts to 27 foot-pounds. Refill the transmission with the vehicle manufacturer's specified fluid and quantity. Reinstall the upper engine mount. Reinstall the intercooler, ensuring all hoses are properly seated and clamps are tightened. Then reinstall the bracket located to the right of the intercooler and assure all the intercooler mounting hardware is tightened. Reinstall the ground cable to the negative side of the battery. For more information on ACT products or the products featured in this video, please visit our website in the description. Thank you for watching.